Every dish she placed on the table was another move in a carefully planned game meant to send him to his death. A mafia boss, the most powerful man in Chicago, wagered his pride and his honor on marrying an overweight female chef for 6 months. He was so certain he was the hunter holding every advantage in his hands that he never realized the quiet woman standing behind the warm kitchen stove had been waiting for this very moment for a long time, determined to collect a blood debt. Will he discover that the cruelest poison of all is kindness before it's too late? Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us as we step into this deadly game of strategy. Dante Falcone was the man the entire city of Chicago feared. An Italian mafia boss with cold gray eyes as hard as steel and a thin scar running along his jawline, he had never lost a single game, whether across a negotiating table or within the shadows of the underworld. To him, people were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. Loyalty was something that could be bought with money, and emotions were a weakness he had buried long ago. So on a night when cigar smoke hung thick inside the private card room on the rooftop, his lifelong friend Vincent challenged him, half joking and half serious, saying he would never dare lower himself enough to marry the overweight female chef who quietly prepared meals downstairs every single day. Dante simply curled his lips into a faint smile and nodded, because to him, it was nothing more than another move to prove that he controlled everything. But Dante didn't know that the woman, Nora Bishop, had deliberately entered his home 6 months earlier, carrying a false name and a heart that had turned cold from unbearable loss. Behind the ordinary appearance that everyone in the underworld looked down upon lay a secret, powerful enough to bring down his entire empire, along with a sorrow born from something his own hands had done many years before. She hadn't come for money, and she certainly hadn't come for power. She had come to reclaim what had been stolen from her, and her weapon was nothing less than the shortest path to a man's heart, his stomach. What neither of them could have imagined was that this deadly game of revenge would ultimately change both of their lives in ways neither of them ever saw coming. That morning in Chicago was wrapped in a veil of cold gray mist, and inside the sprawling Falcone mansion, the pale sunlight filtering through the towering glass windows was only strong enough to illuminate the gentle steam rising from the pot on the stove, where Nora Bishop quietly stirred the soup as though it were the most important task in the world. She didn't look up when she heard the heavy footsteps echoing across the polished marble floor, even though she knew exactly who they belonged to. In this house, there was only one man whose footsteps seemed to make the entire space hold its breath and give way, and that man was Dante Falcone. He stopped at the entrance to the kitchen with both hands tucked into his pockets, his steel-gray eyes narrowing as he studied the woman before him, with a gaze he hadn't bothered to give her once during the past 6 months. To him, Nora had been nothing more than a silent shadow drifting through the house, a pair of hands that cooked his meals, a name he rarely ever spoke. But this morning, after a night filled with cigar smoke and Vincent's reckless wager, he looked at her for the very first time as though she were an actual person. What made him hesitate, if only slightly, was that she didn't appear frightened or uneasy by his presence the way everyone else did. She continued preparing the food that needed to be served. Every movement she made was calm and deliberate, and within that calmness was something he couldn't quite put a name to. "I have a proposition for you," Dante said at last, his voice deep, even, and cold, sounding more like a command than a marriage proposal. "You'll marry me for 6 months. No longer than that. And in return you'll receive enough money that you'll never have to set foot inside another kitchen for the rest of your life." After speaking, he waited. He waited for the familiar reaction he'd seen hundreds of times from other women: shock, trembling, or the flash of greed that always appeared the moment money was mentioned. But Nora simply turned off the stove, wiped her hands on her worn apron, then slowly lifted her eyes to meet his, with such remarkable composure that he almost wondered whether she'd truly heard what he'd just said. In that brief moment, Dante Falcone, the man who had never lost a single game in his life, suddenly felt something very small yet strangely unsettling travel down his spine, because this woman wasn't looking at him as though he were a terrifying mafia boss, nor was she looking at him as though he were her chance at a better life. She looked at him as though she'd known for a very long time that this was exactly what he was going to say. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice completely steady, without the slightest ripple of emotion. When he gave a faint nod, she answered with only a short reply, saying she needed time to think about it, then turned back to her work, as though the proposal she'd just received were no more unusual than deciding on a dinner menu. Dante remained standing there for another moment, unsettled by a response he'd never anticipated, before finally walking away with an unfamiliar sense of irritation because, for the first time in his life, he couldn't read what the other person was thinking. As for Nora, only after the sound of his footsteps had faded into the far end of the hallway did she slowly set the wooden spoon down upon the counter. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, not from fear, but because an emotion she'd forced herself to bury for so many years had finally reached its breaking point. Within her amber eyes flickered a cold light that no one in that house had ever seen before. She'd waited for this moment far longer than Dante could ever imagine. She'd counted every single day since stepping through the gates of the Falcone estate, under a name that wasn't truly hers. And she knew he'd just pushed himself one step closer to the trap she'd spent so long and so patiently laying. "I won't rush," she silently told herself, "because what I want isn't money, and it isn't a marriage. What I want is for him, through nothing but his own arrogance, to walk willingly into the snare, and by the time he understands what's happened, it'll already be too late for him to pull himself free." That night, when the entire mansion had sunk into the heavy silence that could only exist inside a house far too large and far too cold, Nora was still in the kitchen, and she knew Dante would come looking for her, because a man like him could never tolerate leaving one of his own questions unanswered. Sure enough, close to midnight, his tall figure appeared once again in the kitchen doorway. This time, the careless indifference he'd worn that morning was gone, replaced by an impatience awkwardly concealed beneath his familiar mask of composure. "Have you made your decision yet?" he asked. Instead of answering immediately, Nora poured him a cup of strong black coffee without sugar and gently placed it before him with the unhurried grace of someone who owned the kitchen rather than someone employed to work there. Only then did she speak, her voice soft, yet every word as sharp as a blade, telling him that she knew about the wager. She knew about the night filled with cigar smoke on the rooftop. She knew exactly how Vincent had challenged him, and she knew precisely how he'd nodded in acceptance. Dante froze. The hand lifting his coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips, because he couldn't understand how a quiet woman working in the kitchen could know what had happened behind doors that even his own men weren't permitted to approach. For a fleeting instant, his gray eyes flashed with the wariness of a predator that had caught the scent of something deeply out of place. "And yet you still wanted to hear my proposal?" he asked, his voice growing lower. Nora curved her lips into the faintest smile, one that never reached her eyes, and replied that it was precisely because she knew that she'd stayed to negotiate. She wasn't the kind of woman who allowed herself to be pushed into a game without knowing its rules. She laid out her conditions with absolute clarity and without the slightest hesitation. The marriage would last exactly 6 months, not one single day longer. Throughout that time, she'd remain completely independent, and he wouldn't interfere in her personal life. She'd continue standing in this kitchen, preparing meals in her own way, not because he'd ordered her to, but because it was what she chose to do. Dante listened. At first, his brow tightened with the irritation of a man unaccustomed to having someone else dictate terms to him, but the longer he listened, the more curious he became. Every woman who'd ever entered his life had longed for him to keep her by his side, to shower her with status, luxury, and privilege. Yet the woman standing before him was bargaining for the right to leave exactly on schedule and to keep her distance from him, as though marrying the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago were nothing more than an inconvenient business arrangement she'd reluctantly agreed to accept. That should have irritated him. Strangely, it fascinated him instead, because for the first time in his life he'd met someone who didn't crave a single thing he possessed. And with the instincts of a man who'd spent his entire life chasing only what couldn't easily be captured, he agreed almost immediately, never realizing he'd just made his very first mistake. "Fine," 6 months. And you can keep your independence, he said, as he placed the now empty coffee cup back onto the table, then looked at her one more time, as though trying to read whatever lay hidden beneath that calm exterior, but it was useless. After he left, Nora remained standing silently beside the sink, listening as the sound of his footsteps slowly faded into the distance. A feeling both icy and deeply satisfying rose within her, because he'd just signed an agreement with his own hands, believing he was the one who'd won. In truth, he'd just invited the sharpest blade imaginable straight into the heart of his own home, a blade honed through years of hatred and patient waiting, lying perfectly still, waiting only for the exact moment to strike. The wedding took place only a few days later, swift, efficient, and as cold as a business contract, signed by two people who didn't trust each other in the slightest. No church bells were ringing through the air, no tears of happiness, no vows spoken from the heart. There was only a small ceremony held inside the grand hall of the Falcone mansion, beneath crystal chandeliers that sparkled with a lifeless brilliance. Nora wore a simple wedding dress she'd chosen herself, refusing every expensive gown Dante had ordered people to bring to her. As she walked into the room filled with waiting guests, she could feel dozens of eyes turning toward her. They weren't welcoming eyes. They belonged to the capos, Dante's most trusted lieutenants, men dressed in dark tailored suits who stood together in small groups with expressions of open displeasure they didn't bother trying to hide. They looked at her, the overweight woman dressed in an ordinary gown, then shifted their gazes toward their boss, with expressions filled equally with suspicion and contempt. Even though none of them dared to speak openly in front of Dante, Nora could still hear the hushed whispers drifting through the room behind her, cruel remarks mocking the fact that a man so powerful the entire city of Chicago bowed before him had chosen to marry the very house chef who worked in his own home, as though he'd lost his mind or abandoned the authority that had once made the entire underworld tremble. Among the gathering stood one older man, slightly apart from everyone else in the corner of the room. His silver hair was neatly combed back, and his face carried the deep lines carved by a lifetime spent in darkness. He was Don Matteo, Dante's elderly uncle, the living symbol of the old traditions every member of the Falcone family was expected to honor. He didn't laugh, and he didn't whisper like the others. He simply watched the bride in silence with deep, cold eyes, the eyes of a man who'd witnessed far too many schemes throughout his lifetime, not to sense that something about this unusual marriage wasn't right. Don Matteo's gaze lingered on Dante longer than usual, and within that look rested a quiet, yet unmistakably heavy dissatisfaction. To him, the head of the family lowering himself to marry a servant of unknown background wasn't merely Dante's personal affair. It was a crack in the image of unquestioned authority the Falcone family had spent generations building. It was a sign of weakness that enemies outside the family could exploit, and just as importantly, an excuse that those within the family could use to undermine Dante's position. Nora didn't miss that detail, because she'd long ago learned to observe everything in silence. She committed the silver-haired man's expression to memory, the way someone carefully memorized the position of a chess piece that might prove useful later, even though she didn't yet know how she'd eventually use it. The ceremony ended as quickly as it had begun. Dante took her hand in a purely formal gesture before everyone present, completing the ritual he viewed as nothing more than another move in his wager. Then, after the last of the guests had departed and the mansion had settled back into its familiar silence, he led her up to his private penthouse on the highest floor, a secluded residence surrounded by enormous glass walls overlooking the vast waters of Lake Michigan, where the shimmering lights of the city reflected across the surface like thousands of fallen stars. "This is where you'll be living," Dante said, his voice still carrying the patronizing confidence of a man convinced he was placing an entire world into someone else's hands. He waited to see the amazement in her eyes, the reaction anyone entering such extraordinary luxury for the first time would have shown. Yet once again, she disappointed him. Nora's gaze swept across the magnificent surroundings with complete indifference, as though they were no different from a shabby rented room. She walked toward the towering glass window and looked out over the city that had taken everything from her. Then she turned back toward him, and, in the calm voice that had become her unmistakable signature, said, 6 months. Not 1 day more. It was a reminder directed both at him and at herself that none of this luxury held any meaning, that she wasn't here to become his wife, but to fulfill something she'd been preparing for a very long time, and that her heart, no matter how many dazzling lights surrounded it, remained as cold as the waters of the lake beyond the glass, on a night untouched by the sun. The first days of their marriage passed like a silent war that both of them knew they were fighting, yet neither was willing to admit. Dante, driven by the instincts of a man who'd spent his entire life conquering whatever stood before him, immediately set out to do what he believed would quickly soften this stubborn woman, just as it had every woman before her. He began with jewelry, glittering gemstone necklaces specially commissioned from the most prestigious boutiques in the city, priceless pairs of earrings worth enough to purchase an entire house, all of them carefully arranged in her room at his command, as an unspoken declaration of everything he could place at her feet. Yet the following morning, every single piece was returned to him exactly as it had been delivered, untouched inside its box, accompanied only by a brief note from Nora saying she didn't need any of it. Refusing to give up, he moved on to something else. A gleaming luxury car waited outside the front gates, with a private chauffeur standing by to take her anywhere she wished to go. Designer dresses filled an enormous walk-in wardrobe from wall to wall. Invitations arrived for lavish social gatherings, where she could proudly wear her new status as Mrs. Falcone. But Nora declined every one of them with a quiet composure that slowly transformed Dante's curiosity into frustration, because for the first time in his life, he'd come face to face with a wall that neither his wealth nor his power could break through. When gifts failed to produce the result he'd expected, the true nature of the Mafia boss who was accustomed to controlling everything began to emerge. He shifted to another strategy, one more subtle yet even more domineering. Little by little, he began shrinking the boundaries of her world, cutting away the connections she still had with life beyond the estate, building invisible barriers that made her increasingly dependent upon the mansion and upon him. He found endless reasons why she didn't need to leave the estate. He quietly arranged for every task she planned outside the house to encounter obstacles. With calculated precision, he isolated her within the magnificent glass walls, like a rare bird imprisoned inside a golden cage, convinced that once someone had been stripped of every choice, they'd eventually surrender to the person holding the only key. But Nora wasn't the kind of bird whose wings could be broken so easily. She accepted every attempt at manipulation with a calmness that was almost impossible to understand. She didn't protest loudly, and she never begged. She simply adapted in silence, and continued living according to her own quiet rhythm. Every time Dante believed he'd finally cornered her, she'd somehow discover another way to breathe, leaving him with the strange feeling that he was trying to hold water tightly in the palm of his hand. The harder he squeezed, the faster it slipped away. It was in the middle of that relentless struggle that one evening, after Dante returned home from another exhausting day filled with schemes in the shadows of the criminal underworld, he took his seat at the dining table, weary and irritable, expecting a meal he assumed would be as ordinary as every other dinner before it. Instead, the dish Nora placed before him made him stop after the very first bite. It was a simple meal, lacking the elaborate presentation favored by the celebrated chefs he'd hired over the years, yet its flavor carried something so unexpectedly profound that he slowly lowered his fork. There was a humble warmth within it that awakened vague memories buried deep inside him, memories even he couldn't put into words, as though the meal nourished not only his body but also reached a place hidden so far within his soul that he'd believed it had long since turned numb. He ate more slowly than usual. He lingered at the table much longer than he normally would have, and when he finally lifted his eyes and saw Nora standing quietly beside the kitchen, watching him in silence, he had no idea that her calm gaze was carefully recording every smallest reaction with the quiet satisfaction of a hunter who'd just watched her prey place its very first step into a trap that had been waiting all along. A trap she'd patiently woven with the one weapon no gun in his vast arsenal could ever defeat. From that fateful evening forward, something very small yet remarkably persistent began to change within the daily routine of Dante Falcone, although he didn't recognize it himself, because a man who'd always believed he controlled everything rarely noticed the delicate threads quietly winding themselves around his own wrists. He still clung to the habits of a mafia boss accustomed to giving orders. Every morning, he'd tell Nora exactly what he wanted for dinner that night, listing specific dishes as though he were issuing instructions to one of his subordinates. She'd always nod in acknowledgement without offering a single objection. Yet when the meal finally appeared on the table, it was never exactly what he'd imagined, because Nora always cooked in her own way, adding something uniquely hers, a particular flavor, an unexpected combination, a quiet refinement he couldn't quite name, yet couldn't bring himself to reject. At first, he'd intended to complain that the meal hadn't been prepared according to his instructions. The pride of a man accustomed to unquestioned obedience urged him to remind her who truly gave the orders in this house. But every single time he lifted the first bite to his lips, every criticism disappeared before it could be spoken, because whatever she'd created was always better, always reaching somewhere far deeper inside him than ordinary hunger ever could. And so he'd quietly finish every bite, leaving nothing behind, then remain seated at the table with a strange feeling of satisfaction he'd never found in any of the expensive restaurants he'd visited throughout his life. Little by little, those evening meals became the one moment each day when Dante, a man whose life was consumed by endless schemes and constant danger, finally allowed himself to let down his guard. For a brief while, he could simply sit as an ordinary man, instead of the mafia boss who always had to remain alert, and that feeling of being cared for, something he'd been without since some distant corner of his childhood, slowly rooted itself inside him like a silent addiction. He began returning home earlier in the evenings, setting aside meetings that usually took place beneath the cover of darkness, just so he wouldn't miss the meal she'd prepared. There were even nights when he caught himself looking forward to dinner time with an excitement he'd have been deeply embarrassed for anyone else to discover, because how could a man feared by the entire city of Chicago become so vulnerable over nothing more than a meal prepared by the woman he'd married because of a wager? Yet that was exactly what was happening, and the only person who understood every part of it wasn't Dante at all, but Nora, who quietly stood beside the kitchen each evening, her amber eyes carefully observing every subtle change in his habits, with the patient concentration of a master chess player, watching an opponent step willingly into every move that had already been anticipated. She noticed that he was coming home earlier. She noticed that he was eating more. She noticed the way his eyes softened each time he took his place at the dining table. To her, every one of those small changes was another invisible thread, tightening itself around her prey, because she understood better than anyone the old truth that the shortest path into a man's heart wasn't through fear, but through care, not by making him remain guarded, but by making him finally relax. And once the strongest man had grown accustomed to kindness, that was precisely the moment when he became the most vulnerable. Nora never rushed. She revealed no trace of impatience. She simply continued cooking day after day, every meal another carefully calculated move in the long game she'd begun planning long before she'd ever stepped through the doors of this house. And while Dante sat there enjoying every bite, believing that he was the one slowly taming her, she quietly smiled within the shadows of the kitchen, because she knew exactly who was truly being tamed. She also knew that every mouthful he swallowed was carrying him one step closer to the day she'd make him taste the bitterest flavor of all, the taste of betrayal that he'd planted in her life with his own hands many years before. But a few days before that sleepless night, there'd already been an evening when the quiet tension simmering between the two of them finally erupted into a confrontation. Dante, after weeks of failing to make Nora submit, had exhausted the last of his patience and decided to force her into giving him an answer. He found her in the penthouse living room, on a night when the city beyond the towering glass windows lay beneath a curtain of light rain. With a voice carrying equal measures of frustration and curiosity, he bluntly asked what she truly wanted, because he simply couldn't understand how a woman who lived surrounded by luxury, who'd been given everything thousands of other people could only dream of, could stubbornly reject it all as though every one of those things were nothing more than garbage. Any other woman would have been happy to live this life, he said, his voice growing louder as weeks of buried frustration finally surfaced. Yet you keep acting as though none of it's enough. What else could you possibly want? Nora, who'd been sitting quietly beside the window all that time, slowly lifted her head. A fierce light flashed within her amber eyes, a fire he'd never seen before, a flame that had been smothered for far too long and had finally found its moment to blaze. Then she spoke, every word deliberate and as sharp as the edge of a knife, telling him that what she wanted was respect, that she wasn't one of the pieces on his chessboard for him to arrange however he pleased. She rose to her feet, walked toward him, and continued, saying he'd convinced himself he could buy and control the entire world with money, but he'd been wrong, because money could never purchase dignity, it could never buy a person's self-respect, and no matter how much luxury and splendor surrounded him, inside he was nothing but an empty hollow shell. It was that emptiness, she told him, that he simply couldn't bear to face. Her words struck Dante like a crushing blow, straight to the center of his chest. A man who'd never flinched before the threats of the most dangerous gunman in Chicago suddenly stood frozen in absolute silence, unable to speak a single word, because no one had ever dared say such things to him before. Even more terrifying was the fact that no one had ever looked so deeply into the very core of who he was with such frightening accuracy. In that moment, Nora wasn't merely resisting his authority, she was stripping away every mask he'd spent years carefully constructing to hide the emptiness he himself had never dared confront. The realization that this woman could see beyond all of his wealth and power, into the hollow void hidden beneath, left Dante feeling completely exposed, stripped of the armor he'd always believed was impossible to penetrate. A man like him should have exploded in anger. He should have crushed her defiance. He should have silenced her with the authority he'd always commanded. Instead, he simply stood there in silence, allowing every word she'd spoken to sink deep into his soul, because somewhere in the deepest part of himself, he knew she'd spoken the truth, and that was exactly what terrified him. Nora looked at him for one final moment. Without waiting for an answer, she turned and walked back toward her room, leaving the Mafia boss standing alone in the vast penthouse, while the lights of the city spilled through the towering windows. Within that crushing silence, for the first time in his life, Dante Falcone felt a tiny crack appear in the armor he'd always believed nothing could ever shake. It was no wider than a strand of hair, yet large enough to allow a strange and unfamiliar light to slip through. No matter how hard he tried to push it aside, her words about the emptiness inside him continued echoing through his mind in the nights that followed, haunting him, consuming him, forcing him to begin asking himself whether his entire life of conquest and control had ultimately been nothing more than a hopeless attempt to fill the bottomless void he'd never once dared to look into. Not long afterward, Dante hosted a party at the mansion to entertain several important figures from the criminal underworld, and naturally, Nora was responsible for every aspect of the evening's dining. The dishes she prepared left the guests in awe, and no one could have imagined they'd come from the hands of the woman they'd secretly mocked for so long. As the wine began to flow, and laughter echoed throughout the grand hall, Vincent, the lifelong friend who'd started the wager all those months ago, began making his usual sly jokes about Dante's bride in front of everyone. With his trademark smug grin, he remarked that the most powerful mafia boss in Chicago must have had remarkably strange taste to choose such an ordinary, overweight woman as his wife. Perhaps, Vincent joked, Dante had married her for her cooking, because it certainly couldn't have been for anything else. The men around him eagerly joined in the laughter, and once again, contemptuous eyes turned toward Nora, who stood quietly near the edge of the room. She didn't lower her head, she didn't blush, she simply stood there with her familiar calm composure, as though those cruel words couldn't reach her at all. But what no one expected, not even Nora herself, was Dante's reaction. Without warning, he slammed his wineglass down onto the table. The sharp sound sliced through the laughter, and the entire room fell silent as the Mafia boss slowly rose to his feet. In a voice so low and cold that it seemed to freeze the very air around them, he looked directly at Vincent and said that she was his wife, and that anyone who dared utter another disrespectful word about her would live to regret it. His steel-gray eyes swept slowly across the room, and that single glance was enough to make every man who'd been laughing lower his eyes, not one of them daring to say another word. Even Nora was stunned by what she'd witnessed, because nowhere in the countless scenarios she'd imagined over the past several months had there ever been a place for her enemy to stand before the entire underworld and defend her honor. For one brief instant, a strange flicker of confusion stirred within her, before she quickly forced it back into silence. The party eventually came to an end, and one by one the guests departed. Yet that night Dante couldn't sleep. He lay alone in the vast darkness of his bedroom, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in his life, everything he'd spent years building, every ounce of power he'd accumulated, suddenly felt hollow and meaningless. He realized that what had driven him to rise to his feet and defend that woman hadn't been his reputation or the pride of a mafia boss. It had been something he'd forbidden himself to feel for a very long time. He lay there asking himself why he'd become so deeply drawn to her, and the answer unsettled him more than anything else. Because it wasn't her appearance, the very thing everyone in his world looked down upon. It was the meals that reached the deepest places within his soul. It was the sharp intelligence hidden beneath her quiet nature. It was the fearless strength of a woman who could stand tall in a room filled with dangerous men, without showing the slightest hint of fear. Those were qualities he'd never encountered in anyone within his cold and unforgiving world. And while he lay there turning restlessly from one side to the other, one small detail suddenly surfaced from his memory, causing him to frown. He remembered that during the party, when one of the guests had casually mentioned an old restaurant that had closed many years earlier, he'd caught a brief but unmistakable change in Nora's eyes. For the smallest fraction of a second, she'd gone rigid. There'd been a flash of deeply buried pain she'd concealed almost instantly, something he would have completely missed if he hadn't spent his entire life surviving by reading other people. That fleeting moment had vanished almost as quickly as it had appeared, and Nora had immediately regained her usual calm expression. But now, lying awake in the darkness, he found himself replaying it over and over again, like a missing piece from a puzzle that refused to fit anywhere. For the first time since she'd entered his life, a quiet yet persistent question began taking root in the mafia boss's mind. Who was this woman, really? And was it possible that beneath her quiet exterior lay a truth he'd never once imagined? In the days that followed, a strange atmosphere settled over the penthouse. One stretched as tightly as a violin string pulled to the very edge of snapping, and both Dante and Nora could feel it, even though neither of them ever spoke of it aloud. Nora became increasingly distant. She still prepared every meal with care and continued fulfilling every responsibility she had within the house. Yet there was a new silence surrounding her, a thoughtful reserve that was impossible to read, as though she were standing on the edge of a life-changing decision and was simply waiting for the exact moment to take that final step. She spoke less than before. Her gaze often drifted toward the towering windows overlooking the city with an expression so distant it couldn't be deciphered. Whenever Dante tried to start a conversation, she'd answer with only a few brief words, before retreating once more into her own silence, leaving him with the unsettling feeling that he was standing before a firmly locked door, one hiding something he simply couldn't see through. Dante, guided by the sharpened instincts of a man who'd survived countless betrayals in the criminal underworld, began sensing that something was about to shatter, that a storm was quietly gathering behind this fragile illusion of peace. That intuition unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain, because for the first time, his anxiety didn't come from enemies carrying guns or knives beyond the walls of his empire. It came from the quiet woman sleeping beneath the very same roof. He found himself watching her more closely than ever before, noticing every subtle gesture, searching for meaning behind her silence. Yet the harder he tried, the more lost he became, and that feeling of losing control, the very thing a man like him despised above all else, continued growing stronger with every passing day. It was precisely while his thoughts were tangled in that quiet turmoil that Don Mateo came to see him. The elderly uncle with silver hair and deep, penetrating eyes had long since stopped hiding his dissatisfaction with his nephew's unusual marriage. He entered Dante's study with the slow, commanding dignity of a man shaped by the old traditions, took a seat across from him, and in a deep, raspy voice carrying the weight of an entire lifetime spent in darkness, began speaking words that sounded almost concerned, while concealing a warning as sharp as a blade. He told Dante that he'd changed lately, that he'd been coming home earlier, neglecting important meetings, and that members of the family had begun whispering that their leader seemed distracted because of a woman of unknown background whom he'd married because of a reckless wager. Don Mateo reminded him that in the world they lived in, weakness was a luxury no one could afford, that a single careless moment was enough for the wolves waiting in the shadows to tear a man apart. Then he lowered his voice even further, and added that there were already people within the family beginning to question Dante's ability to lead, whispers that, once they'd begun, were nearly impossible to silence. The old man's words pierced the deepest wound inside Dante, because they'd struck directly at the uneasiness already consuming him, while also revealing that the crack Nora had created within him had begun spreading beyond his own heart and into the world around him, reaching even the men he'd trusted most. Dante saw his uncle out with a strained smile and a handful of hollow reassurances, but once the door had closed behind him, he remained standing beside the window, staring out over the city as it slowly disappeared beneath the darkness of night. His heart felt unbearably heavy beneath the weight of two dangers closing in from opposite directions, one from the enemies lurking in the shadows, waiting for the smallest mistake, and the other from the mysterious woman living beneath his own roof. Deep inside, he knew the storm he'd sensed for so long was now dangerously close, waiting only for the first bolt of lightning to tear open the sky. The storm Dante had sensed for so long finally arrived on a night of relentless rain, when heavy drops lashed against the towering glass walls of the penthouse, and flashes of lightning repeatedly split the black Chicago sky. It was on that fateful night that Nora decided the moment she'd waited for all those years had finally come. She sought him out in the living room, but this time there was none of the quiet, unreadable reserve that had marked her in recent days. Instead, her face held a chilling calm, the kind of composure that belongs to someone who's waited so long for a single moment that not even the slightest trace of trembling remains. "Have you ever wondered why I agreed to enter this marriage?" she asked softly, yet every word carried an unbearable weight. Before Dante, frowning, could answer, she continued, telling him it was time for him to learn the truth, a truth she'd kept buried inside herself throughout every month she'd spent living beneath his roof. She told him about a man, a brilliant head chef once admired throughout the entire city, a man who owned a warm and welcoming family restaurant where treasured recipes had been passed down from one generation to the next, a place where people didn't simply come to eat, but to experience the warmth and humanity infused into every dish. "That man," she said, her voice beginning to tremble beneath emotions she'd buried for far too long, was her father. That restaurant had once been her family's entire world until the day the Falcone Empire set its sights on it. She told him that his men had come demanding outrageous payments from her father, turning that warm little restaurant into nothing more than another pawn in the filthy calculations of the criminal underworld. When her father, an honest and courageous man, refused to bow his head, they slowly crushed him. They cut off every means of survival, cornered him until there was nowhere left to turn, until the restaurant went bankrupt and everything her family had spent a lifetime building collapsed into ashes. But that still wasn't the cruelest part, she continued, her eyes now blurred with tears. After losing everything, her father completely fell apart. His health steadily declined beneath the crushing weight of debt and despair. His heart, already exhausted by grief, finally gave out, and he died in poverty, alone in a cold room, taking with him the treasured recipes he'd cherished as the greatest legacy of his life. Dante listened in stunned silence, his entire body frozen, because the moment she spoke the name of the restaurant and that gifted chef, a distant memory from years ago slowly surfaced in his mind. It had been just one of countless business dealings he'd carried out without a second thought during his relentless climb to power. A name he'd long since forgotten because to him, it had been nothing more than a number. One insignificant piece within the enormous machine he'd commanded. "And the recipes you've enjoyed every single night throughout all these months," Nora said, her voice now cold and razor-sharp once again, "are my father's legacy. They're the very dishes you erased from this world the day you destroyed him. Every time you paused because they tasted so extraordinary, you were unknowingly savoring the very thing you took away forever." She stepped closer until she was standing directly before him, looking straight into the steel-gray eyes of the Mafia boss, eyes now clouded with shock, and finally spoke the words she'd carried inside herself for so many years. "All your life you've treated people like pieces on a chessboard, arranging them and discarding them whenever it suited you. But this time is different. This time you're the pawn on the board. And I began laying out this game from the very first day I walked into your kitchen, under a name that wasn't my own." The room fell into complete silence, broken only by the furious roar of the rain beyond the windows. Dante stood there, the man who'd never lost a single game in his life, realizing for the very first time that he'd actually been defeated long ago without ever knowing it, that the woman he'd married because of a reckless wager to prove his power had quietly guided him through every move of her carefully planned game from the very beginning. After Nora walked out of the room, leaving him alone in the crushing silence broken only by the rain striking the towering windows, Dante remained standing there without moving for a long time. Inside his mind, the memories he'd tried to bury for so many years began rising once again, like ghosts that had been imprisoned for far too long and had finally been set free. He remembered the road he'd traveled to reach the summit of power, a road paved with countless ruthless business deals, families driven into ruin, livelihoods crushed without mercy, and people he'd ground beneath his heel without ever once looking back. To him, every one of those deals had been nothing more than another figure in his ledgers, another cog in the vast machine he controlled, faceless strangers he'd passed along his relentless climb toward domination. He'd never once allowed himself to stop and think about what remained behind him, about the shattered lives, the tears, and the broken hearts left in the wake of every step he'd taken. But now, with Nora's story laid bare before him, every one of those nameless faces suddenly had a name, a destiny, and a pain of its own. For the first time in his life, he was forced to confront the true consequences of everything he'd done, not as cold numbers on a page, but as a living, breathing human being who'd died because of him, a father who'd passed away in poverty and despair, leaving behind a daughter whose hatred had grown so deep she'd devoted the best years of her youth to waiting for the day she could finally take her revenge. Guilt tightened around his throat like an invisible hand, a feeling he'd never known throughout all the years he'd spent living in darkness. It brought the man who'd never trembled before, the barrel of anyone's gun, to his knees beside a nearby chair. He sank into it, buried his face in his hands, and for the first time truly felt the unbearable weight of everything he'd done. In that moment, the Mafia boss inside him, the man accustomed to giving orders and controlling every situation, reacted on instinct. A cold voice whispered inside his mind that he should throw her out immediately, that he should order a complete investigation into her past, that anyone who'd secretly placed themselves at the very heart of his home to seek revenge was a threat that had to be eliminated, because that was exactly how a suspicious Mafia boss like him was supposed to respond. But something unexpected happened. This time, Dante did none of those things. He remained seated in the darkness, allowing the crushing weight of guilt to swallow him whole, while that cold inner voice urged him to act, to protect himself, to punish the woman who'd deceived him. Something buried far deeper inside him rose and silenced everything else. It was a bitter acknowledgement that he deserved every bit of this suffering. For the first time in his powerful life, Dante Falcone felt that he deserved to be punished, that the pain Nora wanted him to experience was insignificant compared to everything he'd done to her and to countless others. It was that realization that stopped him. It was that realization that made him choose to remain and face the truth, instead of running from it or striking back. He understood that if he drove her away or harmed her, he'd become nothing more than the same ruthless man she'd spent her life hating. And perhaps, he told himself while anguish slowly consumed him from within, this was the very first time in his life he'd been given the chance to do what was right, even if doing the right thing meant lowering his head and accepting the fury of the woman whose entire life he'd filled with sorrow. From that fateful rainy night onward, their relationship entered an entirely new chapter, and because Nora knew he'd understood everything, had accepted everything without offering the slightest resistance, her punishment no longer needed to remain hidden in the shadows. Instead, it became something open, quiet, yet merciless in its own unique way. She began treating him as though he didn't exist. She'd walk past him in the hallway without so much as a glance, sit across from him at the same table without speaking a single word, and answer every attempt he made to start a conversation with a silence so cold that it made him feel invisible inside the very home he owned. For a man who'd spent his entire life commanding the fear of an entire city, a man accustomed to having every word he spoke met with unquestioning obedience, being ignored so completely became a punishment far more painful than any physical attack could have been. Her indifference reminded him every moment that, in her eyes, he wasn't even worthy of attention. He wasn't even worthy of open hatred. He was worthy only of quietly enduring the deliberate emptiness she'd chosen to inflict upon him. Even the meals, the one part of each day that had once become his only source of warmth, changed. Nora still cooked. She still placed every meal before him with the same consistency as always. But the food no longer carried the humble warmth that had once made him pause after every first bite. It had become cold and lifeless, an intentional punishment, as though she wanted him to taste emptiness through the very thing he'd unknowingly become dependent upon. Every evening he sat there eating those cold, joyless meals in suffocating silence, understanding that she was taking away the one refuge he'd foolishly believed he'd found, showing him that even the kindness he'd thought he'd earned had been nothing more than an illusion she could strip away whenever she chose. One evening, unable to bear the silence any longer, he finally asked why she was treating him this way. At last Nora turned to look at him, and in a voice so calm it was almost frightening, she told him she didn't want to destroy him all at once, because that would have been far too easy and far too merciful. What she wanted was for him to live with this pain every single day, to wake every morning and feel it waiting for him, to carry it with every breath he took, exactly as she'd been forced to do ever since the day she'd lost everything. Her words left Dante speechless because he realized she wasn't lying. This wasn't a burst of anger that time would eventually wash away. It was a carefully calculated punishment designed to last, a life sentence she'd deliberately chosen for him. Yet what Dante never realized was that even while Nora carried out that sentence against him, she herself was carrying a burden of her own. One morning, as she stood before the large mirror in her room preparing for another day, her eyes drifted toward her own reflection, and suddenly she froze. She looked at the woman staring back at her. She looked at the body she'd wrapped around herself for so many years like a suit of armor to survive the darkest days of her life. She looked into eyes that had grown far too accustomed to burying every emotion. Then, in one strange fleeting moment, a single thought flashed through her mind with such force that it startled even her. For all these years she'd devoted every ounce of her strength to imprisoning Dante within the hatred she'd carried for him, yet perhaps the person she'd imprisoned the longest, and the most completely, had been herself, the woman who'd locked herself inside the past, and inside her own pain, so completely that she'd forgotten she was still alive. The thought lasted only an instant before she hurriedly pushed it away, turning her back on the mirror and returning to the plan she'd spent so many years preparing. Yet before it disappeared, it had already planted something small within her heart, the first tiny crack in the wall she'd spent so long building around it. And although she didn't realize it yet, that tiny seed would continue growing with every day that followed. The days that followed became a slow and relentless torment for Dante Falcone. Because the man who'd once made all of Chicago tremble in fear, the man whose every word had carried the unquestionable weight of a command, now wandered silently through his own home like a hollow shadow, quietly enduring the cold indifference of the woman whose entire life he'd filled with misery. The kingdom he'd spent years building, the magnificent glass walls overlooking Lake Michigan, the vast and luxurious rooms, suddenly felt empty and unfamiliar, because inside the very place where he was the master, he felt like an outsider, an unwelcome guest living beneath Nora's silent judgment. He tried to reach her again and again, using every approach a man as awkward in matters of the heart as he was could imagine. He sought her out in the mornings while she prepared breakfast, stood beside her during the quiet evenings, tried to begin conversations, tried to find even the smallest opening in the wall of ice she'd built around herself. He apologized to her. He spoke words he'd never spoken to another soul throughout his proud and powerful life. He admitted his guilt. He confessed the remorse that consumed him more deeply with each passing day. He begged her to give him a single chance to make amends for even the smallest part of the devastation he'd caused. Yet every one of those words disappeared into space, swallowed by her cold silence like stones thrown into the surface of a frozen lake, without leaving even the faintest ripple behind. Nora didn't answer him. She didn't argue. She didn't accuse him. She simply looked at him with eyes so calm they seemed almost lifeless, then turned away and quietly returned to her work. It was that silence, that complete and absolute indifference, that hurt him more deeply than any curse or furious outburst ever could, because it told him that in her heart, he was no longer even worth the effort of a single word. Night after night, Dante lay awake in the vast emptiness of his bedroom, listening to the stillness filling the house, while feeling the immeasurable distance separating him from the woman sleeping only a few walls away, a distance that neither his wealth nor his power could ever hope to bridge. Slowly, he came to understand a bitter truth. His words, no matter how sincere they were, had become utterly meaningless. He realized that a woman like Nora, someone who'd been betrayed by the very promises and cruelty of the world he represented, would never again place her faith in words alone. To her, words had become cheap things that anyone could speak, before breaking them without regret. If he truly wanted even the faintest glimmer of hope for forgiveness, he'd have to prove that he'd changed through something far heavier and infinitely more difficult than words. He'd have to prove it through his actions. That realization didn't strike him like a sudden flash of lightning. Instead, it settled slowly upon his shoulders like an unbearable weight, because he understood that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He'd have to face the very sins he'd spent years trying to bury. He'd have to step outside the armor of power that had protected him for so long. He'd have to become an entirely different man if he hoped to reclaim even the smallest fragment of what had been lost. Yet for the first time in his life, the man who'd always searched for shortcuts and relied on force to obtain whatever he desired was ready to choose the hardest road of all, because he knew it was the only road he had left. Many days passed beneath that cold and lifeless atmosphere until another rainstorm swept across Chicago, the second storm since Nora had revealed the truth, and it was as though the heavens themselves could sense that something unbearably heavy was about to be spoken, as raindrops lashed against the towering glass windows while thunder rolled in distant waves across the night. That evening, Dante found Nora sitting alone beside the window, her gaze lost in the blurred curtain of rain with an unfamiliar distance in her eyes. It wasn't the icy detachment of the days she had spent punishing him, but a sorrow so profound that she no longer had the strength to conceal it. He hesitated before walking toward her, and before he could say a single word, she spoke, her voice so soft it almost disappeared into the sound of the rain, saying there was still one thing she had never told him, one truth she had buried even deeper than everything she'd already revealed. She told him that at the moment when everything had fallen apart, when her father's restaurant had been crushed and her entire family had been swallowed by debt and despair, she hadn't been carrying that suffering alone, because at that time, she had been carrying a tiny life within her, a child she'd already loved with all her heart, from the very moment she'd learned that little soul existed. She told him that during those darkest days, when everything around her was collapsing, when the crushing weight of loss and grief pressed so heavily upon her that she could barely breathe. Her body simply couldn't endure anymore, and she'd lost her baby before she'd ever been given the chance to see that child enter the world. Nora didn't describe the details. She didn't have to. The way her voice broke apart on those final words, the way her hands tightened together against the fabric of her dress, said more than any language ever could, and in her amber eyes, the tears she'd held back for so many years finally slipped down her cheeks. She said that after losing her father, losing her child, losing everything that had once given meaning to her life, she'd fallen into a bottomless pit of grief, and during those long months and years, food had become the only thing that still tied her to life itself. The last refuge she'd had after the whole world had turned its back on her, and little by little her body had changed, growing larger like a suit of armor she'd wrapped around herself without even realizing it, trying to protect herself from a world that had stolen everything she'd ever loved. She lifted her eyes and looked directly at him, and in a voice thick with emotion yet carrying the weight of undeniable truth, she told him that every pound she carried on her body wasn't the result of carelessness, as the people in his world had always mocked, but the mark of the days she'd fought simply to survive everything he'd done to her, that every layer of that armor represented another day she'd forced herself to keep walking when she should have collapsed beneath the weight of it all. Those words struck Dante like the final blow that shattered everything still standing inside him, because now he understood that he hadn't merely destroyed a restaurant, hadn't merely killed a father, but had also stolen the life of an innocent child who'd never even been given the chance to draw a first breath, a baby who'd become another victim of his greed and cruelty, a life whose very existence he'd never even known. The guilt that had already been tightening around him for so long multiplied, until it became almost unbearable, so overwhelming that he could no longer remain standing, and the most powerful crime boss in Chicago, the man who'd never bowed before anyone or anything, finally collapsed to his knees, both knees striking the cold floor as his tall frame trembled beneath a grief and remorse beyond words, because for the first time in his life he was facing the full weight of every sin he'd scattered across the lives of others, and he understood that there are some things, once they're gone, that not even all his wealth and all his power could ever buy back. After that night when he collapsed beneath the weight of everything he'd done, something inside Dante Falcone changed forever, because he understood that apologies no longer carried any value, that no words could ever restore what he'd taken away, and that if he truly wanted Nora to believe he'd become a different man, he'd have to prove it through his actions rather than empty promises. He began with the smallest things, quiet gestures that expected nothing in return. He silently paid attention to the little things that belonged to her and committed them to memory. And one morning Nora walked into the kitchen to find a bouquet of white lilies resting on the table, the very flowers she'd always loved, placed there without a note, without a single word, simply existing as a quiet expression of thoughtfulness. Then, in the mornings that followed, she noticed that a cup of coffee had already been prepared exactly the way she liked it, strong and without sugar, and every evening before bed, there was a cup of hot tea waiting neatly in the place where she usually sat. Everything was done discreetly, without display, without pressure, as though he was learning to care for her in the same quiet way she'd once cared for him through the meals she'd prepared. Only this time there wasn't a trace of calculation hidden beneath those gestures. But Dante understood that these small acts meant only for Nora still weren't enough, because his guilt didn't begin and end with her. It stretched across countless other lives he'd crushed on his climb to power, and so he began a journey that no crime boss in his world would have ever imagined taking. He ordered his people to recover the records of every family the Falcone empire had destroyed, every small business that had been crushed beneath his ruthless hand, and then he personally went to each one, offering compensation, trying to return at least a portion of what he'd stolen. Even when people greeted him with suspicion or outright hatred, he remained patient. He bowed his head because he knew he had no right to demand forgiveness. He established a foundation to help struggling small businesses, using the enormous fortune he'd built from the blood, sweat, and tears of others, to lift people standing on the edge of ruin, slowly dismantling the brutal machine he'd spent his entire life creating, and throughout that process, he gradually withdrew from the darkest operations of the underworld, turning his back on the very road that had carried him to the summit of power. Yet the very transformation that Nora saw as the first true sign of sincere atonement was viewed by his most trusted men as an unforgivable betrayal. Because in a world where greed and cruelty were the highest laws, a leader who suddenly became compassionate and began returning what he'd stolen was seen as an insult to everything their family stood for. Don Mateo, the aging uncle with those deep, unreadable eyes who'd long been dissatisfied with his nephew, no longer limited himself to subtle warnings, because he saw in Dante's transformation not merely a passing moment of weakness, but the beginning of the end for an empire generations had sacrificed to build. He quietly began gathering the dissatisfied capos, the very men who'd looked down on Dante ever since his strange marriage to the cook, feeding their fear that if they allowed him to continue, every one of them would fall alongside him, and the seed of doubt planted on the day of the wedding had now grown into a genuine conspiracy. Within the darkness of sealed rooms, plans slowly took shape. Old vows of loyalty were broken, and a new storm, more dangerous than anything Dante had ever faced before, quietly gathered at the very heart of his own family, waiting only for the perfect moment to descend upon the man they'd once called their boss. While the storm of conspiracy was quietly taking shape in the shadows, something else was silently changing between the two people living beneath the roof of that penthouse, and it began on a cold evening when Nora sat alone on the balcony, with a light shawl draped across her shoulders, her eyes fixed on Lake Michigan shimmering beneath the city lights. She didn't hear Dante's footsteps until he was already standing beside her, quietly setting a cup of hot tea next to her, exactly as he'd done every night for so long without asking for anything in return. Then he simply remained there beside her in silence, not trying to start a conversation, not trying to fill the space between them, merely choosing to be present. Nora looked at the cup of tea, its gentle steam rising into her cold hands, and finally asked why he was doing all of this. Why a man like him would spend so much effort caring for her, seeking out the families whose lives he'd destroyed, and turning his back on the very empire he'd devoted his entire life to building. Dante remained silent for a long moment, his gray eyes also resting on the distant city beyond the lake. Then he answered in a low, rough voice, so unlike his usual coldness, that he was doing these things because he'd finally realized words no longer meant anything, that he wasn't changing only because of her, but because he himself needed to change, because he needed to become someone different from the man he'd once been. She told him he couldn't change the past, that no matter what he did, her father would never come back to life, her child would never return, and the years she'd lost could never be restored. Dante nodded, accepting every word, but then he quietly added with a sincerity she'd never before seen in him, that he couldn't change the past, but he could change the future. It was at that fragile moment, just as their words faded into silence, and an unfamiliar tenderness began to grow between them, that the long-awaited storm finally struck, because from somewhere inside the penthouse came the sounds of chaos, announcing that Don Mateo's betrayal and the conspiracy of the dissatisfied capos had at last become action. The men who'd once sworn loyalty had come to overthrow the boss they believed had grown weak, and in that dangerous eruption of violence, Dante's first instinct wasn't to think of himself or the empire crumbling around him, but to immediately pull Nora behind him, shielding her with his own body from the danger rushing toward them. In that moment balanced between life and death, while everything he'd spent his life building collapsed around him, Dante didn't hesitate for even a heartbeat to place her safety above everything else, willing to sacrifice both his power and his life to protect the woman who, by every ordinary measure, should have been his greatest enemy, and that single act, more than all the flowers or every cup of tea he'd ever placed before her, revealed the man he'd become more clearly than anything else ever could. Standing behind his broad back as he shielded her in the middle of that deadly chaos, Nora suddenly felt something inside her crack open and melt away, because the man risking everything to protect her was no longer the ruthless man who'd destroyed her father all those years ago, but someone who'd truly changed, someone who'd accepted the price of his own sins, and her heart, the heart she'd believed had turned to stone forever beneath the weight of hatred, suddenly trembled with a feeling she'd thought she'd never experience again. And there, at that fragile boundary between life and death, when every passing second could have become their last, Nora suddenly realized a truth that had been quietly growing inside her ever since that morning she'd stood before the mirror, that for so many years she'd lived entirely inside the past, allowing grief and hatred to imprison her inside a prison without bars. But now, in the midst of this danger, for the first time she truly felt alive in the present, longing to live, longing to keep moving forward, longing to free herself from the shadow of everything she'd lost. And within that realization was a sense of freedom she'd been missing for far too many years. After the storm of betrayal had finally passed, and order had at last been restored, a peace unlike anything they'd ever known slowly found its way into the penthouse that had once felt so cold. And one evening, the most unexpected thing of all happened, when Dante himself walked into the kitchen, rolled up his sleeves, and awkwardly began preparing a meal for Nora. He, the most powerful crime boss in Chicago, the man who'd spent his entire life giving orders and being served, now stood clumsily beside the stove, chopping vegetables unevenly and seasoning the food with uncertain hands, yet on his face was a focus and sincerity she'd never seen before. And when he placed a simple, imperfect meal before her, that moment completed a circle neither of them could have imagined, because the woman who'd once used food as her quiet weapon was now being served a meal prepared with all the heart of the man who'd once been her greatest enemy. During that dinner, Dante finally spoke the words he'd carried inside himself for so long. He confessed that he'd fallen in love with her long before any of the changes had begun, that he'd loved her even when she wouldn't spare him a single glance, that he'd fallen in love with her sharp mind, her unwavering courage, and the strength of her heart, not with anything that had to do with outward appearances. And hearing those words made Nora understand that his love was real, that it had never depended on how she looked. As for Nora, throughout the peaceful months that followed, she also began a journey of her own, not to become beautiful for someone else, or to make herself worthy of being chosen, but to reclaim herself. And when she stood before the familiar mirror once again, she realized the woman reflected there was no longer someone hiding behind the armor of the past, but someone who'd found the courage to step into the light, someone who'd finally chosen to live for the present, and that transformation, whether small or great, belonged entirely to her. It was the gift she'd finally given herself after so many years of imprisoning her own heart in sorrow. Those two people who'd once been enemies ultimately chose to remain together, not because of a wager or another agreement, but because they were now two equals who'd walked together through the deepest depths of pain, and, in doing so, had found one another. Then, several months later, another miracle arrived when Nora discovered she was carrying a new life within her. And when she shared the news with Dante, they held each other and wept, because they both understood that this tiny new life could never replace everything they'd lost. Yet it was the light of a new beginning, the child that fate had finally returned to her after so many long years of loss and waiting. They married again, but this time it wasn't a cold ceremony, surrounded by people who looked down on them. Instead, it was a small, simple, and deeply heartfelt celebration, shared only with a few people they truly loved, without extravagance or display, filled only with genuine love and the peace they'd paid such an unimaginable price to earn. At the end of that ceremony, standing in the kitchen where everything had first begun, they quietly held each other and danced to a slow melody. Nora rested her head against his chest and softly whispered, "Who could have imagined that everything would have begun with a wager?" Dante pulled her closer, smiled gently, and answered, "Who could have imagined it would have become the greatest gamble of my entire life?" And in that single moment, surrounded by the comforting warmth of the kitchen and the gentle glow of the city lights beyond the windows, two hearts that had once been shattered finally found redemption together, and a future overflowing with hope. This is where Nora and Dante's story comes to an end, a journey from hatred to forgiveness, from brokenness to renewal. If this story has touched your heart, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so you can enjoy many more moving and unforgettable stories with us every day. We'd truly love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe Nora should have forgiven Dante? And if you were in her place, what choice would you make? Please leave a comment below and share the deepest feelings in your heart, because every message you leave is an invaluable source of encouragement for us. Thank you for spending your time listening to this story from beginning to end. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, lasting peace, and happiness every single day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in our next video.